Everyone. In this video, we will be talking about programming errors. Programming errors are related to learning objectives 9 and 10. 9 says, correct syntax errors and distinguish between them and runtime errors or errors in logic. And 10 says, find and correct logical programming errors using debugging printout, pencil and paper tracing, and systematic search. So just as foreshadowing, the kinds of errors that we're going to be worried about are syntax, runtime, and logical. And in the case of logic errors, there's usually going to be some sort of handwritten or brainstorming component associated to finding what the problem is. A computer is like a mischievous genie. It will give you exactly what you ask for, but not always what you want. So when you make the 3 different kinds of errors when writing your code, the computer will do exactly the thing that has been written and has been compiled to it, but it may not be the thing that you expected to have happen. And furthermore, computers are going to do exactly what you want. Even if you were learning a foreign language and you made some sort of grammatical error, a lot of times people will still understand you and they'll still be able to respond to you properly. And a computer can't do that. So let's talk about those 3 kinds of errors from Learning Objective 9. A syntax error is a typo in the code that causes the program to not compile. A runtime error is when you have some sort of improperly written code that crashes or stops running. So it might compile, but then when you run it, it won't work. And lastly, you have logic errors. The software runs fine, but somehow it produces incorrect results. And it is the worst of the 3 because it's not immediately obvious what the problem is. You might not even notice it. If you get an answer like 198 and you expected 197, it's super subtle. One of the kinds of problems that you could have might be with doing operators wrong. So remember we talked about the order of operations. I said parentheses are going to be first, and then on the second tier we'll have multiplication, divides, and modulus, and then finally we'll have plus and minus. So some of your errors could come from not doing order of operations properly or not using these symbols properly. So let's just understand the types of errors by looking at some example code. Here I have the code that calculates the area of a rectangular prism. So the surface area of a rectangular prism, which has length and width and height associated with it. And I'm also going to include this chunk of code for pi. Final double pi is equal to 3.14159. It's just a constant. It's just going to be in there to, complicate the program a little bit. So you write this code to do area. We've seen this example before in previous videos, but area is width times length plus width times height, and then length times height. And then you multiply everything by 2, and you should get the surface area of the rectangular prism. However, when you compile the code, this time, it gives you an error. And in particular, it actually says areacalc.java7 error, right parentheses expected. And you look exactly at line 7, and you'll see, I am missing parentheses here with length times width. There should be one here to close off the opening parentheses that I have on the left-hand side. So you go ahead and you will add that parentheses in, and you'll try to compile the code again. Okay, great. So it's not always the case that Java is going to be able to find the line number where the issue is, but it's a good place to start. Great. So now the code is fixed. You are going to compile it, and everything seems fine. So let's look at our learning objectives again. And we've just seen what a syntax error looks like. It was the missing parentheses in our case. And now I said we want to be able to distinguish syntax errors from runtime errors or errors in logic. So, of course, we need to be able to know what a runtime error and error in logic look like in order to be able to distinguish. Here I have another example, again using area calc. And when I compile the code, it looks fine. Nothing bad happens. But when the code is run, something weird happens. It gives me all these strange exceptions. Illegal format, precision exception, java.util.formatter, java.io.printstream. So something with the printing is going wrong. But these messages are not super easy to understand. Sometimes you will have to backtrace them, but we'll start at the bottom. It says areacalc.main, areacalc.java13. So it kind of seems to indicate to me that something perhaps is going wrong at line 13, which I have a system.out.printf, and it says line and area. So we have to ask ourselves, did something happen wrong with the printf call? Let's take a moment to review printf. Printf takes in the string that has the formatting in it, and then it takes parameters. And for the output, we write the formatted string to the output stream using the specified format and string and arguments. But the placeholders I have are %d, %f, %s, and %c. So I don't seem to have a %x. Could that be the problem? Well, I saw by reviewing what printf looked like that my parameters were set properly. Line is in fact a string, and area is some sort of double, but that means that even though that the problem is being found on 13, the issue comes from how the string line is being formatted in the first place. So we saw just by checking the table that x is not there, so we probably wanted to use f instead. So we'll go ahead and replace that x with an f, which is a proper formatting string to use, and that will give me the 2 decimal places after the answer like I wanted. Somehow, though, this answer that I'm getting is wrong. So something weird is happening even though I have fixed all the compiler problems and all the runtime problems. So now is where you need to take a moment to try and think, did I go somewhere wrong with my logic? So you have to check your calculations. The code runs, but it's not the right calculation. Let's trace through the program to see what might have gone wrong. All right, I know that a rectangular prism has length times width and width times height and length times height. So I know that there are going to be 3 different combinations here. That's what I expect. And right now when I'm writing this on the left-hand side of my sheet, I'm not looking at the right hand. I'm just trying to think about what the surface area looks like, and even going back to math symbols. So I know I need at least these 3 separate lines. Well, let's go back now. I maybe have learned enough to figure out what is going wrong. And let's see, I do have length and width and height declared, and then I have area. So let's see if anything is going on here. Do I have 3 lines for each of length times width, width times height, and length times height? I have length times height, I have width times length, but I don't have width times height. So something is missing here, and I've now found the problem. And when I'm writing these symbols on here, it's just for me to understand and brainstorm about what's going wrong. And so You can write your brainstorming pen and paper tracing however you like. Let's go through a list of possible errors that you may have had in your code. One is to forget to close brackets. We actually saw this with the first example where I had forgotten to put a closing parentheses. So make sure that for your brackets and parentheses, every time there's a left, there's a right. Another problem that you could have inside your strings is that you're missing quotation marks. We saw the printf that wasn't formatted properly, so this really has to do with making sure that your strings are formatted properly. You could misspell keywords. So we talked about things like int, double, boolean, which are spelled in a certain way, and you need to actually spell boolean correctly to be able to use a boolean. Another important phrase that you'll keep finding is public static void main, so you have to spell those terms correctly as well. And finally, we need to make sure that our math is right. This one I did by actually writing down what I thought the equation should be when my code wasn't working out properly and working through. One more thing I want to point out is a lot of times with making these sorts of typos, a lot of times people forget to do the semicolon at the end of the line, which is super important for Java. Let's give a couple of strategies towards finding and preventing errors. You won't be able to prevent all errors, but you can try to minimize them. The first thing that you want to do is run your code early and run your code often. You want to make your code into small little pieces that you can test separately. And this is the concept of making code modular. Basically, if you break it up into little pieces and check each one of them separately, you can find if each piece is working properly or if somehow in the combination of them it's causing a problem. Another phrase that you might hear in your time as a computer scientist is minimum viable product. So you might want to make the smallest possible thing that actually produces an output and then see what happens. And that way you'll see if when you're adding complexity to your algorithm, if that is what's causing your issues. Then another strategy is to solve the first error first and then rerun. So when you're compiling your code and it causes an error, it often points you to the line that's causing the issue. It may not always be correct, but just try to find that one error, try to fix it, and then run it. You'll still probably have errors because maybe you had hundreds of errors to fix. That's okay. You can now go step by step and see if new things are happening. As I mentioned before, always close a bracket after an opening one. So left and right should always be matched up. As an example, system.out.print, open parentheses, open quotes, close parentheses, semicolon will run. It just doesn't print anything. But system.out.print, open parentheses, open quotes, close quotes with no closing parentheses or semicolon is not going to run. As a reminder and to wrap things up, the learning objectives are 9, correct syntax errors and distinguish between them and runtime errors or errors in logic, and 10 is to find and correct logical programming errors using debugging, printout, pencil and paper tracing, and systematic search. So we talked about the differences between syntax, runtime, and errors in logic. And then I actually showed an example of code that had an error in it and then drew by hand to try and figure out what would be wrong. And I just have one question to leave you with to think about. What error do you think will happen here? And I've written int x is equal to 0, system.out.println 1 divided by x. And I even said that it's an arithmetic exception, but I just haven't told you what that exception is. So take some time to think about that, figure out the answer. And that's it. Thank you for watching.